We're not sticking to it at all anymore because we just wanted to give people time to trickle in. So I guess just think of it more as like a guideline of the types of things we're going to try to do, and I think to some extent we'll just play things by ear and see how things work out. But basically throughout the day, this is a 2-day event, and the real focus of today is on solutions and what do we do next. So yesterday was sort of a protest of anger and outrage against the way things are, but now we really, we have a lot of people from a lot of different groups gathered together, and we really want to focus on where do we go from here. And so towards that end, so our speaker this morning is Professor Lawrence Lessig, and he's the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Prior to joining Harvard, Lessig was a professor at Stanford Law School, where he founded the school's Center for Internet and Society, and at the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Richard Posner on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and also Justice Antonin Scalia on the United States Supreme Court. And I also wanted to say, so like 3 months ago, for me personally, like I had never been politically active in any way, shape, or form. I just thought it was a mess. I didn't know what to do. I was like, whatever. And then I don't know, the whole Occupy thing happened, and I didn't quite understand what that was either. I don't know if anyone still understands what it is, but it was just since, when you're a kid, like I heard stories about the 60s my whole life and all these people coming together and protesting and making a change, and it really seemed like something like that might be happening again. But I still didn't know like what to do. And I don't know, just like one morning I turned on NPR and there was an interview with Professor Lessig on there, and it just made so much sense, I think, to hear him speak and talk about like issues that really seemed like they had the power to unite the country. Like there's so many divisive issues, but this one seemed so obvious and so intuitive to so many people that, I don't know, it was just really inspiring to hear. And so I'm just honored to be able to introduce him today. So thanks so much for coming.
So I want to begin with some sacred texts. Actually, 2 sacred texts and 1 blaspheme against the background of our sacred text. So here's the first sacred text. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1846, on Walden. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Call that one a root striker. That's text 1. Here's text 2. This extraordinary passage, you can barely read it here. Any king, prince, or foreign state. 1787, in Philadelphia, they crafted that text when they wrote the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 says, "And no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state." Now this was suggested to them, this language, because a series of troubling events that happened in foreign states. Benjamin Franklin accepted a snuff box from the King of France with diamonds around his portrait. Arthur Lee had done the same thing before when he had been ambassador to France, and there was a general fear growing in the States that if we imagined our elected leaders developing a dependency on these foreign princes, they wouldn't care enough about their intended dependency upon the people. And so this clause was designed to avoid that dependency by assuring our representatives would be independent. Okay, that's text 2. Here's text 3, the blaspheme. This decision, announced literally 2 days ago, right now, at this moment, right at this time, 2 years ago, January 21st, 2010, a year and a day after Barack Obama became president, the Supreme Court in Citizens United announced that corporations have an unlimited First Amendment right to spend as much money as they want to both promote or oppose any political candidate. That, of course, launched an extraordinary outrage. As Lawrence Tribe put it, it marked an upheaval in First Amendment law. The most serious threat, Jonathan Alter said, to American democracy in a generation. The president, in his State of the Union address, referred to it.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
And it inspired a little bit of hyperbole. Here's my favorite.
This is a Supreme Court-sanctioned murder of what little actual democracy is left in this democracy. It is government of the people, by the corporations, for the corporations. It is the Dark Ages. It is our Dred Scott.
Now, you know, if you're an African American and somebody calls a Supreme Court decision Dred Scott, you might think we're going a little bit far. That was the decision that said that African Americans could never be citizens because the framers thought they were below ordinary humans. Okay, not quite Dred Scott, we can say, but certainly quite significant. And not only outrage and not only hyperbole, it also inspired some extraordinary humor. This is my favorite.
It's a new day. Till now, corporations influence politics with high-paid lobbyists and backroom deals. However, as much as corporate interests game to politicians, we could never be absolutely sure they would do our bidding. But today, thanks to an enlightened Supreme Court, corporations now have all the rights the Founding Fathers meant for us. It's our democracy. We bought it, we paid for it, and we're going to keep it. That's why Murray Hill Incorporated is taking democracy's next step, running for Congress. The way we see it, corporate America has been the driving force behind Congress for years, but now it's time we got behind the wheel ourselves. Murray Hill Incorporated will bring enlightened self-interest and corporate accounting to government to put business first. It is a vision for the future we can all be proud of. Now that democracy is truly for sale, Murray Hill Incorporated is offering top dollar. Vote Murray Hill Incorporated for Congress for the best democracy money can buy.
I'm Eric Henson, designated human for Murray Hill Incorporated. We approve this message.
And unfortunately, they were not allowed to run, actually, in the election. But this decision, of course, also was reviled by all sorts of Americans. This is a point that is often missed. It's not just liberals who opposed it 84% to 15%. It's not just independents who also opposed it around 80%. It was also Republicans. 76% opposed this decision in the week after it was announced. Citizens United, uniting us as citizens in a recognition that a democracy where corporations have unlimited rights to spend whatever they can is not a democracy. Now, 2 years later, it's time for us to reflect a little bit more about what this decision means, what does it say, and how will it affect this democracy? Because we've already seen the beginning. Now, I was inspired in part by that decision to write this book, and I really loved my poetic title for this book, which my publisher hated because he said, what the hell does it mean? And I said, well, it's obvious, Republic, comma, lost. Comma didn't seem to help him much in that, so he insisted we have these subtitles. So here's the subtitle, How Money Corrupts Congress, that's number one, and number two, a plan to stop it. All right, so I want to be very simple here. I want to make it perfectly clear, using the arguments of this book, how money corrupts Congress. And I do that with a little bit of brainwashing, critical part of the story. I'm going to tell you some stories that lead you to this recognition. The first one is around copyright. I became an activist around copyright October 27, 1998, when the president signed into a law a statute honoring this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, a statute which extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. Now, the question Congress was supposed to be asking when it extended terms of copyright by 20 years was whether that could advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright. Remember, copyrights are given to create incentives for people to produce great new works. But the one thing we know about incentives is that they are prospective. It's about what you will do in the future. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So when we ask the question, could this advance the public good, a whole bunch of economists, including 6 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize winner, agreed to join a brief in the Supreme Court saying that this did not advance the public good, but Milton Friedman said he would only join the brief if the word no-brainer was in the brief somewhere. So obvious that you couldn't advance the public good by extending the term of an existing copyright. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million in money from Disney and related companies eager to get Congress to benefit them, the public good be damned. There's another story about IP. I'm sure all of you confronted this terrifying image on Wednesday announcing Wikipedia's shutdown because of some puzzling actions happening in the United States Congress. Those actions were the consideration of the House version of the Senate version of this statute, the Stop Online Piracy Act. Now you might be puzzled, what was this statute about? Well, they tell us what it was about. Here's what it was about. It was about promoting prosperity, creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation by combating the theft of U.S. property and for other purposes. So how is it going to do all of these things? It would do it by enabling courts to issue orders to shut down, to remove from the DNS websites, whole domain names that, quote, engage in, enable, or facilitate copyright infringement. Now, I get the engage in copyright infringement. When you begin to think of all those websites that enable or facilitate copyright infringement, very quickly you realize what this statute is aimed at is the internet, because that's what the internet does. So how would you use this statute if in fact it were passed? As a copyright owner who wants to shut down whatever part of the internet you want to shut down, basically just go to a court and ask, because there's no proceeding where the other side gets a chance to respond or to prove anything on the other side. There's no due process. There's just the ability to come in and make a claim and get this publication removed. Many people said, isn't that what a prior restraint is? Lawrence Tribe at Harvard wrote a wonderful piece saying, in fact, exactly. It is a prior restraint, the sort of thing the First Amendment was designed to limit, but many in Hollywood believe there's a copyright exception to the First Amendment that gives them the right to do whatever the hell they want. The protections of the First Amendment be damned. Now, when you think of this all together, it's pretty extraordinary, this statute, and as many who looked at it concluded, it in fact would kill innovation by increasing insecurity in the internet and creating all sorts of uncertainty about how, in fact, technologies would be liable for this kind of invasive criminal penalty. So the question then was, what exactly is the statute about? We can see it's about combating the theft of U.S. property. Not much evidence that it's about these things. So what really was it there for? Well, that brings us back to the other purposes. MapLight, wonderful organization I sit on the board of. It's in the business of making plain the connection between money and results. Published this wonderful statistic just before the Wednesday protest. Those members of Congress who were supporting this bill received 13 times as much money as those members of Congress who opposed it. Okay, here's another IP example. This statute, bipartisan statute by Darrell Issa, Republican from California, and Carolyn Maloney, Democrat from New York, called the Research Works Act. Research Works Act is created in response to a policy of the NIH, a policy to mandate government-funded research, research that we've paid for, must be available for download for free 12 months after it's been published. You know, for free in a very odd sense, right? Because we, of course, have paid for it. Once, we've paid for it, right? We, the people, pay our taxes, send it to the Treasury. The Treasury then hands it over to the NIH, and the NIH buys a bunch of research, and then we, the people, are supposed to be able to get that research, quote, for free. All right, call it free, call it whatever you want. We were supposed to be able to download this research once we have paid for it. Certain publishers aren't excited about the idea that we could get this research for free. Elsevier, a Dutch publisher, is really excited about the business they're in because it turns out that scientific journals get to charge extraordinarily high rates to get access to these scientific journals. They can charge whatever they want because libraries have to buy them. At least if you're a rich American university, you have to buy them. Most of the universities around the world can't begin to afford this kind of expense. So most of them increasingly shut down access to scientific journals because they can't afford it. But these journals are extremely interested in continuing to raise those prices, and Reed Elsevier is interested in continuing to raise its prices. It doesn't like rules that say scientific articles have to be made available for free, even though the government's paid for them. So Elsevier got their friends, Issa and Maloney, to introduce this bill, the effect of which would be to effectively ban all government open access policies. The government would not be allowed to insist that research it had paid for be made available freely to the public. Why would Congress support such a crazy idea? Well, Carolyn Maloney says, because it saves jobs. Kind of puzzling how it saves jobs, on the theory that if you increase taxes, you get more jobs, because what this is essentially doing is saying we have to pay our taxes twice. We pay our taxes once to pay for the research. We have to pay for the research twice when we want to get access to it. Now, how increasing taxes increases jobs is something I don't quite understand. The other thing she said is, well, it's to advance the public interest in an important peer review publishing system. Forgetting the fact that scientists engage in peer review for free. Nobody pays them for a peer review. So it's not clear why we have to pay the publishers for work that they have done for free, and the government has paid the original research cost to produce. So what explains this crazy statute? I don't have a clue. But here's what MapLight tells me. If you support this statute, you get 6.1 times the amount of money as people who oppose this statute. And if you're Carolyn Maloney, 40% of the contributions Elsevier and its executives have made, 40% have gone to Carolyn Maloney. Or here's a third IP example, not intellectual property, this one IP as in broadband. You probably all recognize this, but broadband in the United States, this is a technical legal term, sucks. It sucks. Any OECD study would show you similar graphs like this. Here's where the United States stands in this ranking here. You know, just a little bit above Spain, and here's Mexico, Chile, Spain, the United States, a little bit below Greece in our IP access through broadband. So the real question for America is whether the future of IP looks like this, as in cable providing fiber to the home, or more like this, your old telephone wires kind of twisted around and turned into DSL, providing you continued slow broadband access. Now, states are increasingly frustrated with the terrible broadband access that exists in the United States. So North Carolina, for example, decided it would begin a project to build out broadband fiber locally. So communities began to support what's called community broadband. Just like you build local streetlights or local roads, they would begin to build local infrastructure around broadband and lease it out at a low cost so that their local citizens and businesses could begin to prosper. And here were the results. These are providers in North Carolina through this community broadband project. And what this graph is telling you is that they're providing faster, cheaper service than all of the ones at the bottom, which are the traditional Time Warner, AT&T broadband providers. Faster, cheaper. This one at the top right is providing 55 megabits upload speed and download speed for the same price that AT&T is basically providing 4 megabits upload speed. Okay, so the basic message from this graph is community broadband worked to radically increase access to broadband in North Carolina. North Carolina is the worst state in the nation for access to broadband. Well, the broadband providers, AT&T and Time Warner, didn't like this. They went to their friends in North Carolina legislature, got them to introduce House Bill 129, which the Democratic governor signed last year. House Bill 129 basically bans all community broadband in North Carolina. They're not allowed, as a community, to build their own broadband to compete with these providers. They have to live in the 20th century broadband provision, even though the rest of the world gets fast broadband. Why would they do this? I have no idea. I can't begin to tell you why it would make sense, but we do know endless campaign funds driven into the legislature got them to pass this statute, and the fear of retaliation led a Democratic governor to sign it. One last example. I'm sure many of you saw these images of the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe and wondered, when you saw those images, how was it that this experimental drilling technology would be permitted without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? I mean, after all, we've just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact analysis to be able to build the Cape Wind project, right? 9 years, 10,000 pages. Exactly how much study was done of the Deepwater Horizon before they were permitted to drill their extraordinarily deep drilling platform to get oil out of the Gulf? The answer is 17 pages of environmental impact analysis before they were exempted from any further obligation. Leading Congress to, of course, say that it was shocked to discover this.
Shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. You win, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required these fast-track approval processes. And why had Congress required them? Well, no clue. I can't begin to understand why they would do it, especially for environmental experiments like this. But here's the one thing we know. There was endless campaign cash from the oil companies pushing for exactly this conclusion, and Congress pushing the regulators into giving them exactly this kind of path. Now, here's the point. No respectable liberal, libertarian, or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these political philosophies. So how do they become core elements of our public policy? Well, political scientists are uncertain. They say it's complex, but here's the one thing I'm not uncertain of. I believe, you know why. All I have to do is point to the money. And you believe you know the root cause in each of these cases for this craziness. And my claim is, number one, it's because of cases like this that Americans believe money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress, a little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we all, as Americans, agree about: money buys results in Congress. Leading to number two, that belief erodes trust in this institution. Gallup reported last year 11% of Americans had confidence in Congress. Then just recently they said the number is actually 12%, but the New York Times reported it's 9%. So, we should put that in a little bit of context. 9% have confidence in Congress. If we had reported, if the CIA had said that in 1974, 15% of Soviet citizens had confidence in their government, we would have declared victory over the Soviet Union. It would say they have no legitimacy, they have no right to govern their people. But 9% of Americans believe in our Congress, right? Certainly the case there were more people who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. And that leads to point number three. This low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote in 2008 registered and turned out more young voters than had ever turned out in any election in the history of elections. And certainly enough voters to deliver the election for Barack Obama. But in 2010, they found that many of their voters were not going to vote again. So they polled them. Why were you not going to vote? The number one answer given by far, 2-1 over the second highest, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans did not vote in the last election, at least in part because of this belief. Okay, so that's point one. Money here erodes trust in the system. But is that all it does? Because, if it's only trust, if it doesn't actually change results, maybe we just should be more trustworthy. Maybe we shouldn't be so skeptical, cynical, right? Maybe we should just believe them when they say the money isn't actually affecting results. Is that all that it does? Well, you can answer that. What does money do here? You can think about this question from two perspectives. One is the substance. How does it change what Congress actually decides? And number two, the agenda. How does it change what Congress thinks about? And about substance, it turns out that the issue is actually a little bit controversial among political scientists. Political scientists aren't quite sure that they can show relation between contributions and actual changes in votes. That controversy is embraced by some ideologues in a way which is a little bit extreme. I was on a radio show with Bradley Smith, who is the former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission. This is what he said. The evidence is pretty overwhelming that money does not play much of a role in what goes on in terms of legislative voting patterns and legislative behavior. The consensus about that among people who have studied it is roughly the same as the consensus among scientists that global warming is taking place. Now, Bradley Smith is not a global warming skeptic. He is a corruption skeptic. I was so astonished by this that I was sitting on the radio show that I was actually on him with, and I had to tweet it at the same time. Then I got in trouble for my hashtag, but that just means Bradley Smith. But so what is the evidence about money affecting the actual results? Well, there's a growing amount of empirical research that's demonstrating a clear and significant statistical relation between money and the actual results that come out. But the one that's most compelling to me is this work by Martin Gylens, who looked at about 1,750 public opinion surveys about attitudes, about what Congress should do. And then he tracked what Congress in fact did. So we see what people wanted Congress to do, and then we see what people did. And of that 1,750, he picked 887 where the views of the top 10% differed from the views of the bottom 90%. So when the top 10% wanted us to go left, and the bottom 90% wanted us to go right, which way did American government go, left or right? Left. And, well, I don't mean left politically, but it turns out right, left in this sense. As he finds, when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflected the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of poor or middle income Americans. As he says, there's a vast discrepancy here between what Congress does and what Congress would do if Congress were actually doing what we, the people, wanted them to do. Okay, so that I think is compelling to support the idea that substance is being distorted by this money. But what about agenda? Because remember, Brad Smith also said, it doesn't affect legislative behavior at all. You'd have to be crazy to think it affects legislative behavior. Okay, let's see if I can convince you you are crazy. The number one issue that Congress thought about in the first 4 months of last year, number one issue that they spent their time in hearings about, they spent their time on the floor debating. What was that number one issue? We had 2 wars. We had a huge unemployment problem. We had a budget deficit crisis. The government was about to be shut down. So what was the issue they spent most of their time talking about? So somebody knows. Somebody was paying attention. The bank swipe fee controversy. Now you say, if you're a normal person, what the hell is the bank swipe fee controversy? As the swipe fee controversy dominated the congressional agenda, it didn't dominate your agenda. The swipe fee controversy is the question whether when you swipe your debit card, banks get more money or credit card companies get less money. That was the number one issue they paid attention to. And why would that be the number one issue, swipe fees? Why did they want to think about that more than anything else? Well, it's this wonderful piece in the Huffington Post puts it, the clock never ticks down to 0 in Washington. 1 year's law is the next year's repeal target. Politicians showered with cash from card companies and giant retailers alike have been moving back and forth between camps paid handsomely for their shifting allegiances. So the point is, you begin to recognize that the very agenda of what Congress focuses its time on is driven by the expectation that doing one thing will help them raise money and doing another thing won't. So why don't they spend much time dealing with the unemployment problem? Turns out it doesn't pay so well to their campaign treasuries. Okay, this is point 2. We can say, I think, with confidence, money distorts what Congress does. So it weakens our trust and it distorts what Congress does. But here's the question, is it corruption? Because the Supreme Court in Citizens United said it wasn't. The Supreme Court said independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption, because if these are independent expenditures, there's no quid pro quo. And their conception of corruption is the only corruption is Rob Blagojevich corruption. The only corruption is this for that. That's the only thing that corruption could be. Now, with all due respect to the Supreme Court, this is totally wrong. Right? And I'm a law professor, so here's my blackboard. Plainly, this is corruption. Right? Here's the sense in which it's corruption. The framers gave us a republic, but what they meant by a republic was a representative democracy. And what they meant by a representative democracy, as Federalist 52 puts it, is a democracy where there was a branch of the government dependent upon the people alone. Right? So here's the model of government. We've got the people, and we have the government. I do my own slides. It's pretty cool to write out boundaries. So the people and the government, this marionette relationship, so that the public good would be found in the context of this litigation between the people, in the context of these representatives deciding what they should do. Here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. It's not just a dependence upon the people, it's increasingly a dependence upon the funders. 30 to 70% of the time a member spends in Congress is time spent raising money. Raising money to get back to Congress or to get his or her party back in power. And as you do that, as any human would, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness of how what they do affects or strengthens or weakens their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust themselves in light of what they know will raise money. Not on issue 1 to 10, but on issue 11 to 999, where nobody will even notice because nobody gets beyond issue 1 to 10. It takes more than 140 characters to do that. Okay, so shape-shifting becomes the norm. So Leslie Byrne, Democrat for Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. And if you think about the dependence the framers were worried about, kings, princes, or foreign states, this dependence is huge, a mountain compared to that molehill. Right? We don't have a problem with foreign princes. We have a problem with domestic princes. We don't have a problem with foreign states. We have a problem with foreign corporations that increasingly exercise their power in our political system by making our representatives dependent upon them. This is a different and conflicting dependence from the dependence our framers intended, a dependence upon the people alone, because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26%, 26 out of 1,000 Americans give more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05%, 5 out of 1,000 give the maximum amount in a congressional campaign. 0.01%, 1 out of 1,000, gives more than $10,000 in a congressional election cycle. So the Occupy movement's so proud of the we are the 99%. Bad marketing, guys, bad marketing. You are either the 99.74% or the 99.95% or the 99.99% who don't have the influence that the 0.01% has because they're the ones funding our campaigns. Now, this is, the Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but they will eventually, this is corruption. It's not brown bag corruption, cash secreted in brown bags to members of Congress. We used to have a Congress corrupt in that sense. Members of Congress, through much of the 20th century, had safes in their office. You think, why would we pay members of Congress in cash? We didn't. It's just they would find bags of cash on their desk and they needed a safe place to put it. So they had safes in their office. But that doesn't happen anymore. Our Congress is not corrupt in that sense anymore. It's not filled with a bunch of Rob Blagojeviches. Instead, this is corruption in a very different sense. It's corruption because relative to what the framers intended, a system dependent upon the people alone, we have a different and conflicting dependence. It is dependence corruption because of this wrong dependence, and that is as much corruption as anything is. Indeed, this is the kind of corruption our framers were obsessed about. They didn't give a damn about the Rob Blagojeviches in the system. They would always be there, and they knew it. Okay, that's how money corrupts this Congress. Wrong dependency distorts the work and weakens the trust we have in the institution. What's a plan for doing something about it? Well, if the problem is the system, not individuals, but a system, the systemic problem here is the funders are not the people. That's the problem. And if that's the problem, the systemic solution is to make the funders the people. To give them away. I don't mean give Congress away. I know people want to do that. I mean give them a way to fund without Faust, without selling their souls, and without thereby alienating most of America, because most of America believes they have sold their souls to those who give money. And one way to do that, and the only way to do that increasingly, I believe, is for us to forcefully and publicly and repeatedly and from left and right assert that we need publicly funded public elections. That we have to replace the system of large dollar funded campaigns with small dollar funded campaigns, following a model like Arizona and Maine and Connecticut, where in those 3 states, state legislators can opt into a system where they accept small dollar contributions only, and those are effectively amplified by the system so that they can afford to run winning campaigns taking small contributions only. In Connecticut, 78% of the candidates who were elected in the first year of this program were voluntary participants in this program. So there are many ways to do this. In my book, I describe a way that's a little bit different from these state models. I call this the Grant and Franklin Project. So here's the way the Grant and Franklin Project works. First, you have to stipulate with me that everybody, quote, contributes. That's called do it or they're going to send you to jail. At least $50 of our money to the federal government in taxes. Everybody does at least that. So that first $50, imagine we rebated it in the form of a democracy voucher. So your first $50 comes back to you in the form of a democracy voucher. And with that democracy voucher, you can give the voucher, any part of it, to any candidate for Congress if that candidate agrees to fund his or her campaign with democracy vouchers only, plus contributions limited to $100 per citizen. So vouchers or $100 contributions, grants, or Franklins. And if you don't actually allocate your voucher, we can imagine it going to the party you're registered to, and if you're not registered to a party, then to a democracy-supporting institution. But here's the thing to recognize. $50 per voter doesn't sound like much, but it turns out to be $7 billion. 2010, the total amount raised in congressional campaigns was $1.8 billion. So that means the Grant and Franklin Project would be at least 3 times the amount of money that was in the system in 2010, and that's not even counting $100 contributions. So this would be real money that candidates could opt into taking and never have to take large contributions again to fund their campaigns. Now, would that be enough? Actually, there was some applause back there in case anybody didn't notice it. I really appreciate it. Yeah. You'll get your voucher after this.
Are you collecting?
So, but would that be enough? And you know, 2 years ago, after Citizens United was decided, despite the fact that I thought it was a terrible decision, I was not sure. I thought maybe that would be enough. We wouldn't have to worry about Citizens United. But I think in the 2 years we've learned that alone would not be enough. It's not enough. Because we've entered the age of the super PAC, which is not just this happy story Stephen Colbert spins, but it's increasingly a very dark story. This is Tony Soprano over here, just in case you're not his cleaned up look. Because it's a emerging super PAC dynamic that is taking over the way politics works. This was described to me first by Evan Bayh, who is a retired senator from Indiana. He's describing, in response to a skeptical question about whether money actually affects results in Washington, he said, look, this is what's happened. He said, before Citizens United, the incumbents were the barons. They had all the power. They had all the money. They had leads in the polls. They knew they controlled the system. After Citizens United, every single incumbent is terrified that 30 days before the election, some super PAC is going to come in and drop $1 million in the race, attacking the incumbent. And so the incumbent needs to respond. But how can the incumbent respond? He or she can't turn to his or her largest contributors because by definition, they have maxed out. So the incumbent has nobody to turn to raise the money necessary to respond to the $1 million in super PAC money. So what does he do? As Evan Bayh described, basically has to buy super PAC insurance. I mean this metaphorically, but super PAC insurance. So that when the bombs get dropped on one side, he can have somebody step in and drop bombs on the other side to balance out these super PAC attacks. Okay, how do you buy super PAC insurance? Well, like any of us, you have to pay your premium in advance. And how do you pay your premium in advance? You do what the super PAC wants. Super PAC says to you, we'd love to help you, Senator, but we can only support people who support us at least 80% of the time. You know as a senator then what you need to do to line up your protection in this protection racket, which Tony Soprano would have designed, this protection racket. You line up your support in advance by doing what you need to do in advance so that if you're ever attacked, you get the support you need. So without spending even $1, the super PACs can begin to bend the Congress to do what the super PACs want so that the insurance has been paid for. This is what Citizens United gave us. This is the radical change which they produced. They had no clue they were doing this, but they've done this. And what this means, I think, is that we need more in response than just public funding. What we need is an amendment to the Constitution. An amendment that explicitly and directly limits the power of independent political expenditures so that Congress has the power to limit those independent expenditures. I don't think they should ban them. I don't think anybody should be silenced, whether it's a person, a corporation, a foreigner, or a dolphin. Everybody should be free to participate in the political marketplace, but they can't have the power to dominate the marketplace so much that candidates not only shapeshift to raise money, they shapeshift to get the super PACs to back them the way they want to be backed. So not banning, but just limiting. If we had both of these, public funding plus a limit on independent expenditures, then, in my view, we would have a world where candidates would be elected by small dollar contributions only. And if we had a world where candidates were elected by small dollar contributions only, then we all could believe, as we all want to believe, that when Congress does something stupid, it's either because there are too many Republicans or because there are too many Democrats, but not because of the money. Because we would have removed the essential factor that leads us to be so cynical, and we would make trust possible here again, if we could achieve these changes. But that leads to the hard question. How do we get there? Because I don't think it's hard to see the problem. We all see the problem. I don't think it's hard, once you see the problem, to describe the solution. What's hard here, maybe impossibly hard here, is to imagine how you bring this solution about. And that's impossibly hard for a reason that was suggested to me by Jim Cooper, who's a Democrat from Tennessee. Been in Congress for as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress. And Cooper said to me, the problem with Capitol Hill is Capitol Hill is now a, quote, farm league for K Street. K Street, where all the lobbyists work. A farm league for K Street, meaning members of Congress, staffers, and bureaucrats on Capitol Hill increasingly have a common business model. The common business model is their business model of life focused on their life after government. Their life as lobbyists. So their time in government is just a stepping stone to their time as a lobbyist when they'll get paid the real bucks and be able to make the money they're there to make. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left to become lobbyists, 42% of the members of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. Everyone in this system depends upon this system surviving. And so how is it we change this system when everybody inside, who otherwise we need to change the system, depends upon it not changing? That presents the challenge. How to find a way around the cancer that is this part of our country. And I think the key is that we begin to move beyond the standard way that the chattering class frames every single political dispute in America as if there's only left versus right. There is left versus right, but that's not the important divide anymore. In addition to left versus right, there's inside versus outside. There are insiders, politicians and politicians' wannabes, and there are outsiders. People like us, people who don't ever want to be a politician, but people who want our government to work. And the key here is we need to find a way to enable this outsider politics, which is not kind of top-down organized politics, it's a genuine grassroots politics. It's not a politics of politicians or politicians wannabe, it's citizen politics. Citizens who don't want to be politicians, but just want politics to work. It is not this kind of passive read-only politics where we just sit there and watch the television commercials and do what we're told to do, but it's increasingly read-write politics where we feel entitled to be engaged and to do things in response. It's an active, engaged, and awoken politics. That's what outsider politics is. But what this outsider politics needs to become is it needs to become an alliance of diverse activists, recognizing differences among these different activists, but acting as an alliance together, an alliance. Think Eisenhower, not the Borg, right? Think this alliance. You know, look at those guys. Working together, not this alliance, all the same working together, right? Different. These three have very different values and views about the way the world ought to be organized. Stalin and Roosevelt sitting together. Or for us, these souls have different views about how the world should be organized and what needs to be done. Now, the thing to recognize about such alliances is that in such an alliance, nobody expects members of the alliance to compromise on their views. You don't have to give up your views. So when America joined this alliance, we didn't have to sing the Communist Internationale to do that, right? We were allowed to be members of that alliance and not embrace communism. That was permitted. These members in such alliances don't have a common end. What they have is a common enemy. And their common enemy is their focus. And they work to defeat that enemy. Now, this alliance is something we have to launch today, and it needs to do two things. Number one, it needs to embrace this cross-partisan, not bipartisan, not compromising on one thing in the middle, but cross-partisan, different people working together perspective. And number two, because we're focused on the problem and not on the differences between us, we have to focus on the rules of the game that make it so we don't trust the system. These are both very hard things to do, maybe impossibly hard things to do, to maintain this discipline. It's hard because the other side is the enemy. It's wonderful to rally us against them, to practice the politics of hate, where we say those guys are the evil ones, the racists, the corrupt ones. That's what gets us going. And the other reason it's so difficult to focus on the rules is that passion is the sort of thing we have for substance, for the actual question of whether we're going to fight for justice or equality, whether gay rights will be defended. Those are the things we really care about. And when people want to start talking about rules, that doesn't quite get us going in the same way. But we have to mature these movements because both sides here are going to be necessary if constitutional change is to happen. And we need constitutional change. Never in the history of the nation has one faction succeeded in achieving constitutional change. Never. The only way constitutional change ever happens is if all sides learn to talk about the issue in a way that makes it plain to everybody. Now, I don't know whether it's possible for us to do this. I don't know whether it's possible. But here's what I do know. I know how it starts. It starts, number one, with a certain kind of clarity. The clarity of Thoreau. The clarity of the root striker, who insists that we find this common ground. And we say here, the common ground is this corruption. Because if we can get people to recognize, to connect the dots. Focus on whatever issue you care about. Global warming, healthcare, unemployment, simpler taxes, smaller government for people on the right. Doesn't matter what the issue is. Connect the dots and you begin to recognize a common pattern. Whether it's healthcare for the reform for the left, government bailouts for the right, global warming for the left, or complex tax systems for the right, financial reform for the left, or financial reform for the right. Once you connect them together, you recognize there is a root cause here, and this is its picture. A democracy where the government is focused not just on what the people want, but on what the funders want. This alliance of outsiders, these root strikers, have to push together to get we, the people, to see this. That's number one, clarity. Number two is passion. We have the passion. We've seen it in wave after wave. We saw it, I think, first when this man was inaugurated. A passion across the country, believing he would stand for change. That's what he told us. He said, for far too long, through both Democratic and Republican administrations, Washington has allowed Wall Street to use lobbyists and campaign contributions to rig the system and get its way, no matter what it costs to ordinary Americans. If we're not willing to take up that fight to change the way Washington works, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. He said that, we heard it, that was a passionate appeal for the transformation we needed. That's one wave. And then people on the right were motivated by a similar charge that led to this explosion of a movement on the right, which now gets expressed in credible and I think uncredible ways. This is the most grassroots version of the Tea Party Patriots, which also is passionate for their own vision of change. And most powerfully, and I think ultimately most importantly, the Occupy movement, which also expressed this passion that then spread around the world for change in the name of this type of corruption. This too is an expression of the passion. And this passion will wake the giant up. Hobbes spoke about the sovereign, the sleeping giant. The sleeping giant wakes up. And when the sleeping giant wakes up, us, the sovereign, the passion we have directed here is the power we need to change this system. So we need clarity and we need passion and a certain kind of courage. Not just the courage of the 99%. There also needs to be a courage among the 1%. I've told this story a bunch of times. Local hero of mine, Arnold Hyatt, is kind of humble. This is the biggest picture I could find of him on the internet. He used to be the president of Stride Right. He was the number 2 contributor to the Democratic Party in 1996. Bill Clinton liked that, so he invited Arnold Hyatt and about 30 other fat cats to a dinner where they were allowed to tell the president what they thought the president should do. And Arnold said, Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940 when he came to recognize he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Because he said, Mr. President, you too have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, but a war against a certain attitude produced by us fat cats. An attitude that says merely because we are wealthy, we are entitled to direct government policy. Merely because we've been successful in the marketplace, we're entitled to get the president on the other end of the phone. People who have convinced America that democracy does not work. We are the problem. Now, you can imagine, just put yourself in Hyatt's shoes as he's in this room with 30 other fat cats and the president telling the president that the fat cats are the problem. A little bit of silence after he spoke. The only published account we have of the evening said that Clinton's response effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. That took courage. It took courage to expose yourself to that kind of humiliation. So we need courage of the 99%, courage of the 1%, but also courage of the reformers. This decision is a terrible decision, but it's not enough to reverse Citizens United. It's not enough to simply declare corporations are not persons. It is not enough to announce money is not speech. Those are too easy. If we're going to go to the land of revolution and all we get is this simple t-shirt, we get nothing. Because those changes alone will not change the corruption that has destroyed this government. The must-haves might include a declaration in the Constitution that corporations are not persons. But it must include a limit on independent expenditures, express limit on independent expenditures, and it must include publicly funding public elections. Now, as I've gone around to reformers and said to them, they need to talk about these three together, I get told, it's too hard. It's too hard. It's too hard to convince Americans that we need publicly funded public elections. It sounds like more taxes. We can't, it's too hard. And to talk about constitutional amendments to limit expenditures. The ACLU won't like us. It's too hard. It's too hard. And it is extremely hard. This is the hardest political movement this country has seen in 100 years. 100 years. And if you ask me whether we're going to win this movement, I'm not sure we are. I tell the story at the end of my book of speaking at Dartmouth, and a woman stood up and she said, "You convinced me. It's completely hopeless. There's nothing we can do." And as I say in the book, when she said this, I had this flash. And I thought to myself, what if a doctor came to me and said, "Your 8-year-old son, he has terminal brain cancer, and there's nothing you can do." And I thought, would I do nothing? And I think if you think about that, you begin to recognize how we humans act in the face of total irrational motivations because of love. That's what love is. It is the willingness to act even when you are told by the experts it's impossible to win. Now there are those among us, soldiers, who go off and fight wars. The connection to our democracy is much more abstract and convoluted than anything I've said today, but they do it for love of country. Love of country. And all we need is a similar love of country, not to motivate people to kill other people or to die, but just to fight, to restore this republic. Whether you believe it's impossible enough or not, this is something we all have to do. Thank you very much.
So we have another microphone up here, and I think the easiest thing to do is to ask people to come up, and we'll try and form a line here for questions, and that way everyone can be heard. So maybe we'll start over here, and then try to snake back that way. So start this way.
Well, I have a very simple question. I hadn't heard of that whole concept of root striking, and I know a lot of people who are striking at the branches of evil. How can we convince them to strike deeper?
Yeah, that's my question for you. So what Root Strikers is, and this is our outreach director here, Solomon Gray, is an organization trying to spread this education. There are lots of organizations trying to motivate, to get people to vote out some member. But we just want people to connect the dots. And we want them to do it face-to-face. So house parties and creating their own videos, remixing other videos that begin to spread the message. So with every issue, people begin to say, okay, you care about healthcare, just recognize the way you're not getting what you want in healthcare because of this issue. You care about global warming, you're not going to get anything because of this issue. Again and again until finally people say, enough. We have to commit to this anti-corruption fight before we get what we want. So the reason I fling myself wherever I can, to talk about this issue is to get more root strikers. You know, I went on Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart made fun of our name, root strikers. He said we should call ourselves Batmen. Okay, fine. Batmen or root strikers, whatever you want. It's the same idea. We need to rally a world to fight to educate other Americans so that they join us too.
Thanks. I realize I don't have a question so much as 3 or 4 things that I would like to know that everybody in this room knows, but I'm just going to limit myself to one. Campaign, public financing of campaigns was passed in Massachusetts, and it was buried, and eventually the legislature was embarrassed enough, so they had to pass legislation to rescind it. So that's so much for that. I just want to say, you know, there's several things like that that have to be resolved.
I agree, yeah. So it was passed and then not funded, defunded, and then erased. Right.
It's
exactly right.
Massachusetts.
I noticed you didn't say anything about the role of private broadcasters, perhaps because that's where you really get into the serious free speech antinomy of the word. I actually think that until any connection between private broadcasters and political messaging is broken, I think that you're going to be facing a really serious problem. I was wondering if you could address that. And also, kind of I remember when the Telecommunications Act of '96 went through. Well, I think I remember that the corporations, some of whom played key roles in drafting that legislation, they actually told the president and the administration that they would commit to a certain amount of free political time to be made available to candidates, and they just reneged on that. That's true, right?
So I don't know about the precise promise. What they've done, and the trick that has allowed them to really profit from these campaign commercials, is that they committed to giving candidates the lowest cost rate structure for their political campaign ads. But the lowest cost rate structure says that you can be preemptive. So you buy an ad, but if somebody pays more, they can kick your ad off. So no campaign can afford that, so they all have to pay the highest amount to these broadcasters. You're right, I haven't tried to take on the broadcasters. In fact, the public funding proposal that I'm talking about here would give more money to the broadcasters because there would be more money to spend. The broadcasters should like that. So I don't want to take on everybody at the same time. And I have a lot that we could talk about how outrageous the public airways welfare was, and how we could achieve a lot by reclaiming the public airways and releasing them in a way that could be used by the public much more effectively. But I'm happy to not have them in the field because it's going to be enough taking on the lobbyists and Washington.
Fantastic speech, thanks. Quick question about why you are focusing on a limit instead of a ban on spending by independent parties. I mean, I think we're not talking about participation in a broad sense, including lobbying and all of the other ways. But why do you think that there needs to be a limit rather than a ban?
Yeah. So, because I don't think a ban is necessary, I think that. And my presumption is a basic libertarian presumption. We should be free to do what we want to do as long as there isn't a really compelling reason to restrict us. So here's why I don't think it's necessary.
Can I just clarify one thing really quickly? Just why is it that you think that corporations and unions and other independent entities should be able to spend politically, and why shouldn't it just be limited to people? Just to rephrase, sorry.
Yeah. So. It's another rephrasing of the libertarian bias. The libertarian bias is we should say no to the government saying no unless the government has a good reason to say no. Okay, so does the government have a good reason to say no, you can't speak? So for example, one of the most compelling cases that came up in this line, the Supreme Court recently just refused to consider. It was a case brought by a bunch of legal immigrants, people who are legally here, who are affected by American government policy, who wanted to participate in the political process. And laws say they're not allowed to participate in the political process. So Exxon is allowed to spend as much money as it wants independently, but these legal immigrants cannot. And my view is, yeah, these legal immigrants shouldn't be allowed to vote because they're not citizens, but they should be allowed to say whatever the hell they want. I want to hear what their view is about the way Americans treat legal immigrants. I'd also like to hear about illegal immigrants, but we don't even have to go there, right? I'd like to hear what anybody has to say as far as this is our idea about what's a good idea. But, and so long as they're saying, here's a good idea about what's our good idea, I think Americans can deal with that. We'll listen to the idea. If we like it, we like it. If we don't, we don't. And if it gets a really great idea, then other people can pick it up, including politicians, and say, here's a really great idea offered to us by some French, well, not likely, but okay, some citizen here, somebody who's, or some legal immigrant here. The thing that we need to worry about is when they have so much influence that they distort what our representatives do in order, they shapeshift to become favorites of those. That's the problem. That's the corruption. And it's that difference that actually explains what happened in Citizens United. Citizens United is a nonprofit documentary film corporation. That's what they are. They're right-wing, but they're a nonprofit documentary film corporation. In my view, the First Amendment, should they have had a right to spend their money to promote their stupid film about Hillary Clinton? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that has nothing to do with corruption. That has nothing to do with a system where people are constantly bending themselves to be favored by this dominant spending by some particular entity. That's because there's a world of difference between Citizens United, the nonprofit, and Exxon spending $100 billion in an election. There's a world of difference. But the court couldn't see a difference. The court said Citizens United has a right, so therefore Exxon has a right. And I just think it doesn't follow. So I want to say, I don't care if anybody says what they want to say or puts their film out for me to see, well, that's fine. I just don't want a system where members are terrified of the $1 million being dropped the last day, so therefore they buy super PAC insurance in advance. That's the corruption. And that's the thing I think we have to address.
I guess I'm wondering if we should be focusing on controlling incentives once they're in office. Because, like in my experience in DC, like the lobbyists, they write half the legislation. I was at the Dodd-Frank hearing, and I was having coffee with a bunch of lobbyists who were bragging about how they wrote large sections of that bill. So campaign stuff, I guess it's good, but once they get in office, there's all sorts of incentives that lead them to do the wrong thing anyway.
Yep.
And second point of order, if all that matters is like this less than 1% of the country, then is spreading these ideas around really going to help?
Yeah, so with respect to the first, what you got to think about is the way that the change that I'm talking about begins to change the incentives throughout the system. Okay, so right now, Jack Abramoff has a really compelling book, Capital Punishment, which talks about his experience on Capitol Hill as a lobbyist, a super lobbyist. And he said the most important strategy he deployed was with staffers. So he would go to a staffer and he'd say, when you're finished here working for Congressman Senator Dodd, you should go work for us. And once he said that to that staffer, Abramoff writes, I owned him. From that moment on, I owned him. No deal had been struck. No money has been handed out to anybody. It's just that staffer knows that his future is Jack Abramoff. So whenever Jack Abramoff needs something, he's going to give it to him. Okay. Why is Jack Abramoff so powerful here? Because Jack Abramoff was also channeling millions of dollars of campaign contributions to candidates. And those candidates, incumbents, needed that money. So they gave Jack Abramoff what Abramoff wanted, so they got what they needed. All right, change the political system for funding campaigns. The lobbyists don't have that power anymore. They still can come in and say, here's our great idea about financial reform, but they don't have the ability to hand out money. John Edwards used to say, when we used to quote John Edwards, there's all the difference in the world between a lawyer giving an argument to a jury and a lawyer handing out $100 bills to the jurors. And that's the difference our system doesn't recognize right now. So if you change that system, lobbyists are not as powerful. They're not as powerful, then they have ideas, but people don't have to listen to them. Members then are more independent from them, and some members will actually do the right thing.
But just to clarify one thing, I mean, if banks can basically hijack the regulatory system, couldn't the corporate sector in general just hijack the public funding system?
Yeah,
well, the same thing through the state. So they would dole out money through the government.
So you mean if we had the voucher system, for example?
Sure.
No, I don't think they could. If everybody has their own voucher, sure, Bank of America could say, yes, take your voucher and devote it to our Bank of America candidate. And we would all laugh, right? I mean, the point is, they would have to persuade us to turn over our $50, as opposed to this system where they can basically channel unlimited amounts of money, their own profit, to the candidate that they want. So the other part of your question is really important, though. Can't they just subvert the reform system or the reform effort? That's the whole reason I'm talking about outsider politics. You're right. The insiders are not going to do it.
Right.
They're not going to do it. People you worked with are not going to do it. Their whole future is keeping the system. So we have to build the impossible, the outsiders. And that's why Occupy is so important.
Thank you. Hi. So a lot of people here, including myself, and I think it's probably almost everyone, feels that that funding has a really adverse effect upon Congress and the way they act. However, then on the other side, you have folks like Bradley Smith who say that there's no discernible direct connection between the two in terms of the results. I guess the question I have is, even if Bradley Smith is 100% correct, right, if you can prove that there's no actual connection, then that's sort of beside the point, because as long as politicians themselves perceive there to be a connection, they'll continue to ignore ordinary people. So I guess what I'm wondering is there any research right now looking not at the public's perception of the connection or what Bradley Smith is doing, but what the politicians themselves perceive? It's clearly their behavior, spending 30% to 70% of their time in trying to gather up funds, proves absolutely beyond all doubt that they have that perception.
Yeah, and this is why when you actually talk to real politicians about it, they kind of roll their eyes. Are you kidding? People actually believe this doesn't matter? They'll defend themselves and say, yeah, of course, I've never changed my vote because of money. But that's the point of shape-shifting. You didn't have to change your vote because your position was adjusted in advance. You knew where you had to be in the place that the money was going to give you the money. And if you were so deluded not to understand that's what's happening to you, then we need a psychoanalysis to get you to the point to recognize what's going on. Because all ordinary humans recognize you enter into this reciprocal relationship with someone who's giving you extraordinary amounts of money and making it so you don't have to spend 80% of your time raising money, you only have to spend 70%. You are obliged to them. That's an obligation you have. And you feel it and you act on it, whether or not you will admit it to the public. So there's lots of psychological research making exactly this claim. And I just think, the reason I wrote this book is I was so infuriated with the fact that this argument was even allowed. So, there's 160 pages in this book that try to blows this argument up. That, whether it's true or not, people believe it, and so that's enough of a reason to do something about it. But it's not even true. What Bradley says is not even true. There is the evidence to show that it's affecting results, and you just have to look at it in the way that is obvious to look at it to confirm what politicians say. There is results.
I just have one last question, and that is, in your presentation, in terms of things that can be real drivers in moving this forward, in terms of passion and love and courage, I'm absolutely in favor of all of those things. I was wondering if you would consider in your presentation adding one more thing, and that's stamina. Just because the NAACP, I think they met in Niagara when they founded themselves in 1905, when Brown versus Board wasn't passed or wasn't decided until 1954. Seneca Halls, they had a meeting about as big as this, and there was about as many people there in 1848, and women didn't get a right to vote wasn't guaranteed until 1920. So it takes a long time.
Yeah, but my fear is we don't have that long.
Yeah.
We don't have that long.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. It's a great service. I have, I guess, a two-part question, and that has to do with the transpartisan idea. First of all, could you elaborate when you said that no constitutional amendment is passed without, I think, something akin to transpartisan support? Elaborate on that. And number two, bring it into the present. The media loves to talk about the gridlock in Washington, the indissolvable problems between the right and left, and as you pointed out, that completely misses the point. They also often point out that this is a conservative country, but serious public opinion polls again and again show that in many respects this is a very progressive country. So my question is, does an emphasis on the Could that possibly come from a mistaken analysis of buying into that idea that this is a conservative country, or that there's a big split between left and right? And could another possible tactic be to simply try to harness the power of progressive thinking in the country and take that route?
Yeah, so let me just answer it in reverse order because I get to the same point. I don't like the word progressive actually because the original progressives were not, I'm a liberal, I'm a leftist, right? I'm not a progressive. The original progressives were transpartisan.
I really like about you.
Okay, so as somebody from the left, of course I'd love the idea, I'd love to dream, right? That the left is going to rise up and convince America that a million ideas from the right are crazy and we have the right sense and to end with it. I'd love to. I just don't believe it's going to happen. I don't believe it's going to happen. I don't believe it's going to happen because maybe I'm overly charitable to the right, and maybe that's because when I was a kid, I was on the right. I was the youngest member of a delegation in the 1980 Republican convention, right? So then I grew up, but I was on the right when I was a kid, right? So, and I don't think it's as simple as I think some people think, that it's just about pointing out a math error and all of a sudden people are going to become, leftists. They're not. It's a very complicated problem. So if you are saying we've got to wait, we can convince us all to, I just don't think it's going to happen. So happy for you to try, but I'm saying at the same time you're trying, let's see if we can get another kind of movement going that doesn't try to dampen your desire to rally people for causes that you and I agree about, but also says, look, we can also just put that aside for a moment and recognize another fundamental thing that we all should be able to agree about. And I actually think historically there's a pretty good example of that. That's the founding of this republic. We look back to the framers and we think, oh, they're basically the same guys, 74 white elitists sitting in a room in Philadelphia drafting a constitution. It is really a naive conception of who those people were. There were people in that room who believed in slavery. And there were people in that room who believed slavery was the moral abomination of the age. Now, whatever you think about the Tea Party, there is no difference between the left and the right as profound or as important as the difference about slavery. Yet they were able to discipline themselves enough to bracket that long enough to save the nation from its certain demise, to put us into a position where we eventually could deal with the slavery issue. Of course, we had to fight a war about it, but deal with the slavery issue and actually build a nation that could do a lot of good. Now, I just think we need that same kind of discipline here, the same kind of discipline. Not to deny, I'm an abolitionist in this. I want to say I'm the abolitionist. Of course, the other side thinks they're the abolitionists, but whatever. We're on the side of right, but there are other problems, and the problem we've got right now is this nation is collapsing in the sense of any legitimacy to be a government and to govern this nation. And we can't afford not to deal with the problems we're not dealing with. So I just want to get to the place that we can begin to deal with those problems by finding a way around this really important difference on the left between the left and the right, long enough so that we can get a playing field where it's fair for us to fight on the left.
I pretty much agree with you. I was playing devil's advocate a little bit here. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I had two questions. My first question is, there are a lot of groups that are proposing amendments, but none of them have all of the three things that you talk about. And so my concern is that if we pass 772 and we fight this hard to get it to go this far, and then it's not enough in the end, it doesn't do enough. So how do we make sure that what we're working for is what we get in the end? That's the first question. And my second question is, it seems to me in your presentation you talked about the bank card swipe fees, and then also a little bit about SOPA. It seems to me that the way to get anything done is not to really fight the fight ourselves, but to get the money to fight the money. And I guess, how do we build allies with other, money people who might be on our side? Because I feel like if you can get money to fight the money, then we tip the scale.
Yeah, great questions. Your second one is overwhelming the first because just say the first. Say one word from the first one.
So the first one was, if we fight this hard to get an amendment, and it's
great
not
question,
enough.
right? So absolutely, this is what's frustrated me about these amendment fights. You have these different movements that have their own little, business model of a movement that I think is, feeling a little bit too tied to the particular part of the problem they've identified. And what we need to do is have a conversation where we recognize how everybody here is seeing one part of the problem, and now we have to sit down and put together the solution. And actually the best group to have done this so far, in my view, is the Occupy DC group. They passed a resolution last week, I think it is. I think it's more than that, maybe a week and a half ago. And it got reported as a corporate personhood resolution, but that's not what it is. It's a corporate personhood resolution, it's a limit on independent expenditures resolution, and a public funding resolution. It's all three of these things together. And I think we need more people to begin to stand up and say, you know, obviously, these are important steps, but let's figure out what the group together has to be that we're going to get, because it would be outrageously tragic. Many people would say it's a classic leftist tragedy, but here it's a classic leftist tragedy, that we go and we motivate the world to eliminate corporations as persons. But they would love that. They would love that. Oh yeah, okay, fine, we gave in to you. We gave in to you. You're no longer able, you won. Corporations are not persons. It would still be the case that 0.01% of Americans would be more influential than 99.9% of Americans. 0.05 would still give the maximum amount of, there would be no change in the underlying structure of power in elections. So it's not enough. And we, in these movements, have got to begin to say to our leaders of our own movements, this is not enough. I like it, but it's not enough. I want a movement that's pushing for all of the change we need and asking for all of it. And if in the very last moment we got to compromise by cutting off a tiny bit, let's compromise at the last moment, not 10 years in advance. And as your second point, how can we get the big money against the big money? It's always, you know, it's the other part of that swipe fee controversy is one senator saying, you know, anonymous senator, he wouldn't identify himself. He said, you know, I got here, I was so surprised. All the fights are either, you know, some rich greedy bastard versus another rich greedy bastard, or some rich greedy bastard versus some small rich greedy bastard. You know, basically that's all the fights are, because that's all the money is around a rich greedy bastard. So I think it'd be a great thing to do. But I actually think there's another opportunity here that's similar. This system right now is not stable. You know, I said, remember, before the incumbents felt like they were the barons. But increasingly, the incumbents recognize they're the vassals. And they've got to go suck up to the barons in order to get the barons to give them super PAC insurance. And they hate that. They hate that. So watch the way Newt Gingrich, 2 months ago, would have said, there's no problem with unlimited expenditures by super PACs. What's wrong with that? And then after Iowa, he's like, whoa, there's something wrong with this system where they get to spend all the money in the world. This is really outrageous. Of course, his response is then to spend his own money in unlimited fact. The point is, this suggests a strategy. Imagine we found, you know, a couple billionaires on our side, or even just one, who was willing to fund his own super PAC. And that super PAC spent $3 million in 20 Republican Senate seats. $3 million. You wouldn't even have to win. You wouldn't even have to change the result at all to create terror in those Republican senators. This is a kind of political terrorism. It's peaceful, but it's terrorism. Yes. And the point is, if 20 senators all of a sudden thought, Republicans all of a sudden thought, oh my God, this system is really awful, you would crack the Democrat-Republican divide that exists on this issue and make it possible in the next Congress to have a serious conversation about bringing Republicans and Democrats together to change the system.
Thank you. And also, we're going to take a few more questions, but I just wanted to get a temperature check before we move on. Do we want to take more questions and answers, or do we want to move into open discussion? More questions? Okay.
Thank you. You talk about how hard this is, and perhaps impossibly hard. And you talk about cross-partisanship. You also emphasize that you think this needs to be a grassroots movement. But why not try and enlist, you know, George Will and Paul Krugman to, you know, endorse this? A cast of celebrity Republican intellectuals on both sides, and get some top-down energy behind this as well.
I don't say that we shouldn't do that. I think we should. I'm not excited about politicians. being part of this. And I think people immediately kind of turn off when they see politicians. I think it's just part of the same game. So I'd like to see lots of, leaders, not just the kind of George Will types or the Krugman types, but, people, leaders in business, who could begin to credibly say that I'm not in this because I want to become a senator, or I'm not running for Congress, or I'm not going to be a presidential candidate, but I've been successful in my own business, and I want to now do something to save this republic from what we all see as its demise. So yeah, absolutely, I want everybody to be part of it. But it's got to start with this kind of surprising grassroots movement. I mean, what's surprising of the last 3 years is not what Paul Krugman said. What's surprising is what Occupy Wall Street said, and what the Tea Partiers said. That's what was surprising. And I think we need more of that.
It seems the Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown campaigns are in some kind of negotiation about how to prevent this, what you call bomb in the latter part of the election. That's our local campaign. What would you suggest as a position that we would ask both candidates to adopt?
Yeah, so I'm not a believer in unilateral disarmament. There are a lot of people who try to run their campaigns. I was working with a guy who was a former Iraqi soldier, a veteran from the Iraq War, who ran a campaign in Michigan where he took only $1 from everybody. It was his maximum contribution. Because he thought corruption was the #1 issue. He was a Republican. This was his campaign. And it's a brave thing to do, but he lost. They all lose. They all lose. And I don't think we need losers. We need people who win. But we need people who win with a very clear commitment up front. And so what I said to Elizabeth Warren, who I support strongly, I worked very hard to get her into the race, is I want a very clear commitment that this is a #1 issue for you. Like, you will co-sponsor the legislation. We need to fix this system. And I think that's the most we can ask. The politicians will hire the consultants, will get them elected. Elizabeth Warren is going to have a good shot, but all the money in the world is going to be rallied against her extraordinary amount of money, right? Because Karl Rove has made this his campaign. He got even George Bush elected, so he's going to stop Elizabeth Warren. This is just what do you do after you get George Bush elected? What could be even a bigger challenge? Stopping Elizabeth Warren, that would be the most difficult thing in the world to do. Well, he's going to try to do it. Cap his political career. I don't want to handicap Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I don't want to weaken it. I don't want to, by saying that you ought to tie your hands behind your backs. It's enough to me that I believe she is committed and will take the steps necessary to make the reform we need, and that's what we should push for.
So, in terms of asking both candidates to adopt a position, you think it's possible?
It's not hard to ask. It's impossible to credibly commit on either side. Because in the last week before the election, if you're down, you're going to use whatever weapons are in hand. And breaking a promise in the last week of the election is not hard.
I arrived in the middle of your presentation, so feel free to dismiss me if you addressed this already, but I'm wondering about the limited liability of shareholders and the responsibility of the board of directors to make profit for the shareholders. And it seems to me like because of that, like just making corporations not have First Amendment rights isn't really going to solve, like that corporations will manage to find other ways to get in at the political process. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think this is an extremely important point to recognize about corporations. I was at the Occupy, I was at the celebration last night in New York, right in front of Foley Square, and what I tried to say there was, this is the thing the Supreme Court missed. Humans, when the framers gave us the system of government, what they wanted was a system for classical Republicans. It was not George Bush Republicans or Mitt Romney Republicans. Classical Republicans are Republicans who believe that the job of the government, of the representatives, of the citizens, is to act in the public good. Not in your private interest, but in the public good. And citizens do that. You know, they go off and they fight wars. Not because it's going to benefit them, but because it's in the public good. They believe fighting fascism is in the public good. Or they run up the stairs in the World Trade Center, not because they're doing something for themselves, but because they're serving the public. Or they sleep in Zuccotti Park, or they sleep out in the Occupy Boston, you know, not because they're doing something for themselves, because they're doing something. That's what individuals, that's what persons do. Corporations don't do that. They're constitutionally structured not to do that. Their job, according to their charter, is to make money for their shareholders, not the public good. And if they focus on the public good exclusive to the shareholders, they get thrown out. It's a violation of the charter. So this is a very important difference. And when you bring corporations into the political system, you cannot begin to imagine that they're going to act in the interest of the public good. They're going to act in their own private interest. That's a reason to distinguish them. But it's another big step to go from that to say we should eliminate corporations, or we should not have self-interested economic actors in the economic sphere. I think self-interested economic actors in the economic sphere, properly regulated, is a good thing. It produces lots of great wealth and lots of great jobs, and you know, it's part of the economy. The problem is just we don't allow these spheres, we don't keep these spheres apart. So what I'm talking about are limits to keep the spheres apart. They get to make their great widgets, but they don't allow the corrupt capitalism. No more crony capitalism, not the kind of corruption that we've seen. And so I think that's enough. When we start with that, and if it's not enough, we'll talk about what's next.
I'd like to talk a little more about the Iowa primary and how Romney was able to flood basically the airwaves and monopolize them pretty much to drive the Gingrich's numbers way down. I think it's a really critical case, and if you think that democracy should involve some kind of a free market of ideas, it seems that there, at least temporarily, there was a monopoly of ideas on his part by his PAC and the money behind it. And, I think that, as was suggested before, possibly there is a chance for bipartisan reform to end the super PACs and their money bombs and that kind of thing. And I'd like to see that be maybe a tactic that this movement would use, and as a step to public financing of campaigns and that sort of thing, and banning the last-minute money bombs. But I wonder why don't we hear more about the free market of ideas, not just from the standpoint of an individual being able to express themselves as much as they want with as much money as they want, but what about the overall playing field? When you look at Speaker's Corner in London, if somebody's got a megaphone and they can drown out everybody else, that's not democracy, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I agree with you. The big part of this problem is the distortion that's created by this endless amounts of money. And that distortion can only be addressed after Citizens United by a constitutional amendment. It's the only way we could regulate that. Okay, so we should have an amendment. But then the question is, should we have just that as the amendment? My view is that would be a terrible, terrible waste. Not as bad as just getting corporations or persons. That would be an even worse waste of an opportunity. We need to get an amendment that limits independent expenditures, but also an amendment that mandates public funding of public elections. Those things have to go together. Because we're not going to have perpetual reform in this nation. Like the giant wakes up, the sovereign wakes up, says what, utters one or two words, and goes back to sleep. And when you're awake and we get the sovereign to do something, we've got to get everything we need. And what we need is public funding, limits on independent expenditures, and if we get those first two, I'm happy to throw in corporations or not persons, fine. But the first two are the essential ones. So we've got to do both of them right now and right away.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just think that as a tactic, it would be good to have a shame campaign or a ridicule campaign against these gross distortions. And this Gingrich example in Iowa is just a great example of that.
It's just the beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So first, I just want to thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. I think it's a really great turnout, and there's a movement in the sense we're a leaderless movement, but I mean that doesn't mean that we don't need leaders out there. And I mean, this is sort of our first step in engaging, but I really hope we can continue to work together in the future.
I would love to. Thanks.
And,
I'm happy to do whatever you tell me. I'm not. You're the leader.
okay, yeah. Okay, so let me tell people what's happening.
I mean, if you also have questions, I can just stand here and we can continue, and some people can ask me questions. Yeah.
Are there copies of Republic Lost here? Or no? No? Okay. So let me tell people, there's one copy in the back. Okay, so next. So we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants here. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break.